People were asking me, how can you live in Pakistan? Everything I see on the TV is so bad. I said, you all need to get a bigger TV. There's good things happening.
Yeah.
The KFC branches run by the deaf have the highest income of all the branches because people go out of their way to go eat there. The chicken tastes better. People with disabilities don't like that term differently abled. Pakistan has come up with it and used it everywhere, but it's not appropriate. They're not differently abled. They're just as able as anybody else. There's a great definition of empowerment. Empowerment is not something you do for somebody. It's moving the obstacles out of the way so they can do what they need to do.
Hello, Assalamu alaikum. It's a very, very special episode of the Pakistan Experience because there are few people who've done phenomenal work in Pakistan and we've already started talking about it. You must have heard of FESF. He's the founding director and the DeafReach program as well, which we will discuss today. Richard Geary, how are you today, sir?
I'm very well. And thank you for having me on your program.
No, thank you for all the work that you've done over the years. I know it's been 3 decades since you've moved here, but how is the heat treating you?
I don't think the heat's treating anyone very nicely, you know. I've been here now for 36 years in Pakistan. And in Karachi, I think this is the hottest summer we've had yet.
That's how I feel as well.
Yeah, just brutal. And what bothers me the most, though, we survive. Look, we're sitting here in a nice air-conditioned room. What about all the people that not only don't have air conditioners, but they don't hardly get, bijli and pani, and the conditions are very challenging when the heat gets like this,
So I've heard you say that you didn't choose Pakistan and Pakistan chose you. It's like Oliver's is where you chose the warrant, but you're a wizard, Gary. But what was it about Pakistan? Why do you say that Pakistan chose you?
Well, so little history here. My wife and I are parents of a deaf child. My wife is from the Philippines, by the way. She was in the education sector, and we were both working in the social development sector. We met in the Philippines. And because our son was deaf, we got involved in working with deaf children. Sometimes God has his hand in your life, and these were other choices that I didn't make. And at that time, this was, mind you, before the internet, if you can imagine that, back in the...
I'm old.
Yeah, okay, good.
I just look young.
Yeah.
I was born when you opened your first school. It was 1989.
We got a letter from some colleagues who were in India at the time. They said, why don't you guys come to India? There's so many deaf kids everywhere. And, I know you're trying to work with deaf kids. We said, let's go. We are young and adventuresome. And we went and spent a few years in India. And then another friend of ours who was in Karachi at the time wrote us and said, can you guys come and help me out for a few months on a project? So we said, sure, why not? We came to Pakistan, took the train, Delhi, Lahore, down to Karachi. And
if only we had an American passport and we could do the same thing.
It's okay. Only. I'll share mine with you.
I'll give you my green one, which you wanted.
Yeah. and while we were here in Karachi, interestingly enough, we met a friend who was a businessman. He said, look, I have this office space in Sadr. Why don't you guys take it and do something with it? Regal Cinema Chowk, Regal Trade Square building up on the 5th floor. The lifts don't work. The pond-stained stairways. But we set up our first small DeafReach tuition center there. We had 2 little rooms, maybe about as big as this. And we had teenagers coming over. They wanted to learn literacy, help them find a job. And some parents heard about us and said, oh, what can we do? Our children are deaf. Can you help us? We said, sure, bring them over. Now, they lived in Baldia town, mind you. So then we found a donor who was willing to sponsor a van to pick and drop some of these children. And all of a sudden, we had a small primary school group and then a teenage group. So we were doing 2 shifts in this little tuition center. And from those small beginnings, this just grew. More kids came. We had to find a larger space. And my wife and I looked at each other and said, how can we leave? We can't just abandon this. We've started something. And 35 years later, here we still are.
If I may just take a step back, I believe Michael got meningitis when he was 1, right? So he wasn't born deaf.
Yeah. He contracted meningitis, which left him deaf, which is a very common cause of deafness in Pakistan. And that...
And how do you contract meningitis? It's just a viral.
It's just a virus, and if you don't treat it properly or you don't recognize it in time, there's antibiotics, which we gave him, but it often creates deafness by attacking the auditory nerve. So that drastically changed our lives, It was very heartbreaking to find out you're a parent of a child with a disability, yeah? It takes a lot of... And we were young, and I got very angry at God, I guess you could say. Like, how could you do this to me? I'm doing such a good thing. I'm doing this good work. At that time I was in the States working with kids on the street and stuff. But sometimes the things that happen in our life happen for a reason, Someone once said to me, look, the things you learn taking care of that one child one day might benefit many, and that's proven to be very true.
So that's an interesting aspect of it. That how did that change you in terms of learning not to react with anger, but then being like, okay, this is something that has happened. Let's not only do good for my child, but now let's also do good for millions of other children like this.
Yeah, good question. I was young. I think I got stuck in this cycle of, as you said, anger, or I was kind of discouraged, and oh my God, when I looked ahead and how are we going to take care of this? This was before, again, the internet. There was very little information, and a wise gentleman who I looked up to, he was one of my mentors. He said to me, look, Richard, an experience like this can make you bitter or better. It's a choice you have to make. And I was like, that kind of shocked me, because I realized I was becoming bitter. And I vowed right then, okay, we're going to let this make us better. And it was the start of a journey that has taken a lifetime, honestly, So
in this internet generation, one assumes that if you're in the United States, if you're in Canada, 1 million services are available. You can go somewhere. There's schools, there are teachers who are trained how to deal with this. So back in, I believe this was 1975.
When
was it the same? Did these services available, or did you had to learn on your own?
I mean, at that time, there were services available. America, Canada, Europe, they had good medical services. There was no internet, but you just have to go to a local hospital, get referrals, go talk to doctors. So that's all there. And we did get
in terms of schooling and learning.
And we could have made the decision, okay, let's just settle down here now in America where we have good services. But that wasn't our life's pathway, We had dedicated our efforts to helping those that needed help, and were mostly living in developing countries. And we had to make a choice, and we felt we could do that without sacrificing the needs of our son, because there are schools for deaf children, there are services everywhere. They're just maybe not as sophisticated. And when we came to Pakistan, that's what we saw, that the educational facilities for deaf children were not all that advanced, and there were very, very few opportunities. The minute you step outside of the major cities, Karachi, Lahore, there's really nothing available. And at that time, when we started this small tuition center, we said, wow, what we're doing is making a difference. Let's see if this can't grow and help change the lives of so many other deaf children, which, thank God, it has.
So maybe what I was getting at is that a lot of people who are listening, we look at Karachi Down Syndrome Program, phenomenal organization, but they're not in every city in Pakistan. DeafReach, I believe now it's in 5 cities?
No, now we're in 9 cities.
Phenomenal.
But that's a drop in the bucket.
Exactly. So for people who are listening, who might have a child who's deaf, who might have a child who might have a visual impairment, who might be going through that process, who might be feeling bitter, are there any resources that you can maybe recommend, or is there a way to going about it which helped you, which can maybe help them?
Well, first of all, I think the most important thing for parents and families is to get good information. Because ignorance creates a lot of fear, right? So, and there is a lot of information available online, and these days almost everyone has a smartphone. So if they just Google, organizations working with deaf children. I'll speak about deaf children specifically, but I mean for any disability it applies. And start researching and looking into it. And I'd be more than happy to answer anyone that writes us. Just look. Our website is DeafReach.com, and our emails are there. But what we would like to do now is expand our program to reach so many of these unreachable areas. There's about 10 million deaf people in Pakistan. And
10 million?
Yeah, and over 1 million deaf children of school age. That's a huge number. Hardly 5% of those children have access to education. So what a gap, right? But if you're looking at it from a marketing perspective, it's a great opportunity. So what we realize, we have these 9 large campuses, but we can't set up a huge brick and mortar situation in every location. What we can do, and what we're doing now, is setting up DeafReach satellite schools, taking underutilized space in existing buildings, setting up 2 or 3 classrooms, training a teacher. We have digital learning content that we've created, so it's think like Khan Academy for the deaf. And now any kids that are living in those areas can come and attend that satellite school. So in this year now, we've opened 8 of them. In this coming year, we're looking at open 20 more. And in the next 5 years, I hope we'll have hundreds across the country.
You've mentioned the information is available. Unfortunately, the rumors which persist. So in terms of people who are born deaf, there's this idea that maybe it's genetic, maybe it's hereditary. Do you have any idea that how it happens?
So deafness, it's either genetic, which is called congenital deafness, or it's acquired after birth due to illness or accident or whatever. So, and the incidence of deafness is about 50-50. Acquired deafness comes due to illnesses such as, we mentioned, meningitis, measles, mumps, anything that causes a high fever can damage the auditory nerve. Congenital deafness happens because deafness can be a recessive gene. Now, if you're deaf because you got sick, then your children, that's not going to be a gene situation. But if there's a recessive gene and both partners carry that recessive gene, then some of their offspring and or grandchildren will be deaf. And the incidence of deafness is higher in Pakistan and other developing countries, particularly because of poor medical care, so that there's not the proper intervention, especially in rural areas. And then interfamily marriages where they're both carriers of that recessive gene. So basically, rough numbers, about 0.1% of any given population in the first world will have some hearing problem. In Pakistan, it's closer to 1%. And that's a big number when you're talking about 250 million people.
And I'm assuming you're more prone to deafness from disease at a younger age. Is there...
Definitely. I mean, there are late deafened kids. I mean, but generally it happens in those first few years of life. Babies contract illnesses. And
so I'm sure the lack of healthcare in Pakistan is a huge...
Yeah, if it's not treated properly, yes, yeah.
And when you say deafness... I'm sure it's not a binary, right? Because people who are hearing impaired, is there a standard that once you cross that, you would be legally maybe categorized as deaf?
And let's talk about terminology just for a minute, because the deaf don't like the term hearing impaired. They don't feel they are impaired in any way. And like that old term deaf and dumb, for example, that's out
of the window. But if
politically incorrect.
But like, for instance, you're not visually impaired, but your eyesight isn't great because you're wearing a glass. So there is a spectrum, maybe. I'd love to know how these are categorized.
Yeah, okay, it's good. It's good. Basically, deafness is not all or nothing at all. There's different levels of hearing loss, right? So there's what's called mild or moderate hearing loss, and children that have that with hearing aids can develop good speech, can learn to hear and speak as well. Keeping in mind that speech is a function of hearing. Children mimic the speech they hear in their household, and they can speak any language in the first 2 years of life, right? But a deaf child is isolated and deprived of language. So after a moderate hearing loss, then you've got a severe and profound hearing loss. Think of a profound deafness is when you can feel a door slam or the motorcycle take off or an airplane, but you can't make out speech. The frequencies of speech are much more higher pitched. Those children don't benefit much from hearing aids. You know, hearing aids are not some magic bullet. Neither are cochlear implants, which are very expensive, by the way. So the deaf community identifies as deaf because of their native language, which is sign language. And it's similar to the black community, the Memin community, the Hispanic community. They're a culture defined by their language and their history and their social, mores, etc.
So anybody who'd be able to put on a hearing aid and hear just like you or me would not be part of the deaf community as such?
It's interesting. There are what you would call high-functioning deaf people who have good oral skills, and they can choose. They can be in the hearing world, or they can also be in the deaf world. Being part of the deaf world is the fact that you sign as your means of communication. So there are some that are sort of straddling both sides. The kids we take care of in our schools, almost 95% of them, they're all profoundly deaf, and sign language is the medium of instruction.
I think you touched upon the idea of language deprivation, which I think is a phenomenal idea and something that we don't think about.
Yeah.
That even if you're not speaking to the child, and now people also talk about the fact that if you're pregnant and you're speaking to the child, the child is still picking on it, hearing music. So when the baby is there and the baby is hearing communication, it has all that available to himself or herself.
And he develops language.
But for somebody who's deaf, does not have that. So I think you've spoken about it before as well, but I'd love for you to expand on this idea.
So think about this. A hearing child, by the time he's 5 years old, will have been exposed to tens of thousands of words and have easily understand, 5,000 words, 10,000 words. He picks it up from the TV, from his family discussions, from everywhere. A deaf child, where no one in the family circle signs, they maybe have 50 homemade signs that they develop: sleep, eat, drink, So the real challenge for a deaf child is not his so-called disability, it's that he's language deprived. And when that child has the opportunity to come to school, when I think of kids that come to us when they're 4 or 5 or 6 years old, and all of a sudden they're surrounded not just by teachers who are communicating with them, but by their peers. It's like pouring water on a thirsty plant, and it just blossoms, And because language is the key to learning. Before you can even learn, you have to have a language to learn with. And that's really the challenge. And when deaf kids who come to school late, when they're 9 or 10 or 11, it's very hard because they've missed those early language learning years. If you have children of your own, those key years are 0 to 5. There's some magic thing that happens in a child. If you're speaking 2 languages at home, he'll understand 2 and speak 2 or 3 or 4. But by the time you turn 6, 7, 8, you have to start learning a language. And I'm still trying to learn Urdu. Bahut mushkil hai.
It's I've seen you. I've heard you speak
Urdu.
Urdu.
I just can throw a few words here and there, man. But let's not carry this in Urdu.
I'm sure you know all the abuses. Those are the first things we teach any Gora that comes.
My kids learn those.
So, being deaf is not an intellectual disability. But what you're talking about, one assumes, like, let's say if a baby or a child is able to say, oh, I'm feeling sad because I want to watch my favorite movie, which has this character who looks like that's a well thought out thought.
Yeah.
But maybe somebody who those language and those words are not available might be feeling the same way, but might only be able to communicate that person's sad. Does that then hamper the cognition? Does that hamper the intellectual development of that child as well?
Well, what happens is deaf children get extremely frustrated because they can't communicate clearly. I remember our own son. He would just throw temper tantrums, and I couldn't figure out why is he so angry all the time. But I realized later it's because he just couldn't communicate. And it wasn't until I took the steps and started learning sign language, and all of a sudden, there was that pathway, and those tantrums sort of disappeared. So it's so important for parents of deaf children, regardless of they're in school, they're not in school, from the very early ages, if they can just even have some basic sign language, so that child has a name for everything, milk, pani, bread, butter. I mean, just think of all the words in a household, even if you can't communicate in complete sentences. We created a sign language dictionary. It's online, a digital dictionary, and anybody can access that at home. It's free of cost. It's at psl.org.pk. Not Pakistan Super League.
Pakistan Sign Language.
It's Pakistan Sign Language. But what happened, this is the first ever digital dictionary of sign language in Pakistan, and it's available countrywide, and all the schools are using it now. And people in the workforce, for example, if you hire a deaf person and you need the vocabulary to talk to them. So this has been a real asset.
It's a phenomenal job that you've done, and I was quite surprised to know that before FESF there wasn't a Pakistani sign language.
Well, there was a sign language. There's always been sign language, but it wasn't documented properly.
It wasn't. But before I get to that idea of sign language, as somebody who's not part of that world, when you communicate, when you learn sign language and you communicate, is it eventually the same as you and I communicating? Is the language and the experience just as rich when you learn, or do you still feel like for most people it doesn't go beyond simple communication?
I think it depends how much you invest in it. It's like any language, right? I would recommend you watch this movie called Coda. It won the Academy Award 2 years ago. It's about a deaf family where the hearing daughter, she's an adult, she grows up and she's the interpreter for her whole family, her mother, her father, her brother. And it's really well done. It's got a lot of comedy sections in it, but it shows you the depth of what sign language can be like. And when deaf people are communicating with each other, there's a free flow of communication. When hearing people who know sign language are communicating with deaf people, maslaniya is a free flow of communication. But when you're just learning sign language, sort of, if you and me start having an Urdu conversation, I'll be just like a baby sign language person, right? It takes a little time. So, but yes, it's a legitimate language that its own context. You can discuss and describe anything.
And in terms of sign language, it has nothing to do with the language, right? Like, for instance, the American Sign Language is not tied to English, or the Pakistani Sign Language is not tied to Sindhi or Urdu.
So, good question. I think you really did your homework. You're asking some very good questions. First of all, sign language is not international. Sign language is indigenous to every country, just like the spoken language is indigenous to every country. And you're right, it is not tied to the mother tongue of that country because it's not a spoken language. So and some sign languages can be similar from the same region, like Indian Sign Language and Pakistan Sign Language, Nepali Sign Language. There's a lot of similarities because there was cross-pollination. But let's say you're in Europe, there's French Sign Language and German Sign Language and Spanish Sign Language. They all live next to each other, but they're totally different. And even
I'm sure the easiest is Italian Sign Language.
Probably.
Because even people who speak, it's the same, right?
And even English, American Sign Language is different than British Sign Language, and Australian Sign Language is different also, even though English is the written language. So, just like any language, it's a grassroots language that grows from the community upward. So in Pakistan, the deaf community have been signing to each other for centuries. It's only recently, though, that we've come to where we can document it, teach it in schools. And this is what's happening in the U.S. It's more advanced. They teach it as courses in universities. I would like to see that happen in Pakistan as well.
ASL, yeah, I think people can just
ASL,
opt in to learn ASL.
But here we can teach PSL.
Well, we should.
We should, definitely.
It's been on my bucket list for many years, honestly, because a really good friend of mine, I don't know if you know Samar Naqvi, used to work at Now PDP.
Samar, yes, of course. And
so I love Omer, and
we're good friends.
And like every year I've been like, maybe I should learn. And every time I go and I meet people there, like they're just such beautiful people, and I'm like, I should be able to.
At least some basic.
Yes,
you know?
I should be able to.
Like salam.
I should go beyond just ordering at KFC.
Yes.
No more. That's another great initiative. It's the one on I. Chandigarh, right?
No, well, we started this project with KFC, almost 15 years ago. We opened the first branch in Gulshan. Now there's about 10 KFC branches that are deaf-run. And they also hire deaf boys and girls across their 75 branches. So there's over 200 deaf boys and girls working at KFC.
So in terms of the sign language that you're talking about, the strength of the community is the community factor. But unfortunately, I'm assuming that in Pakistan, what hurts people the most is isolation. That when deaf people don't find that community and they grow up separately from everybody else, they might not be attuned to the same sign language and might develop one of their own.
Exactly.
So then when they come to you, is there a process of incorporating?
Well, it takes time. I mean, you're very right. Deaf children are very isolated. They're very neglected. And sadly, because there's this antiquated mindset about disability, it's like, oh, masur bache side pe roke. And, deaf children are...
Bichare is how we think about it.
And if we look at deaf children not as a disability group, but as a minority culture that just speaks a different language, it changes our mindset. And we realize if we can give them education and training in their language, they can do anything. And that's been our foundation at DeafReach. So in our schools, all of our teachers are signing. All of our classes have full sign language presentation. We're not focused on trying to teach kids how to hear and speak. That's not our job. That's the job of a speech therapist. And if parents want to take their kids and do that after school, that's great. If they, it's not easily affordable either. But there's been this huge battle over the last century, if you will, between what they call oralism or signing, right? And for the longest time, it was considered wrong to sign. They would discipline children and tie their hands down and forcing deaf kids to be, quote, normal. But then over the last a quarter of a century, there's been a strong movement amongst the deaf community saying we are who we are. We want our language. We want to be, we have the right to be who we want to be. And this started, of course, in the U.S. and now it's spreading globally. And I support that because...
Now that you mentioned this, I did see some video which was connected to the cochlear implants where that was also a decision that whether you want the cochlear implants or not. And that was tied to this conversation.
It's very controversial. Like the medical world preaches cochlear implants as the magic bullet. And of course, it comes at a very high price. But even, benefit of the doubt.
So people who are listening, what do they biologically do, the implants? How do they work?
Well, your cochlear is the inner ear, right? And it's where the hair cells are that translate the vibrations from your eardrum and converts them into electrical energy, which sends them along the auditory nerve to your brain, which you translate as sound. In deaf children, what they do is they bypass the cochlea because there's damage to that auditory nerve. It's not working. They insert a small probe into the cochlea, which takes the place of that process. So this probe picks up the electronic or the sound that comes in, translates it into electronic signals, which sends it to your brain. And it's not like automatic. It takes training. It takes a lot of speech therapy. It works well in some children. It doesn't always work in all children. But any child, even that does have a cochlear implant, would benefit from being amongst his peers in a signing environment. And ultimately, when he gets older, he can choose, well, am I part of this world? Have I developed my speech and hearing well enough that I can function in the mainstream, if you will? So,
from the other side, from somebody who's not privy to the conversations or the community, and I've also seen videos of these children who are able to see for the first time, and just the sheer emotion that you feel, one would assume that is just a net positive, right? If a child is able to see for the first time, and that's the analogy that I'm drawing. So if a child is able to hear, what is the from the outside, I don't understand what the negative connotation.
Well, it doesn't always work. It's not like, oh, now I've got this cochlear implant and now I'm just going to speak clearly. I mean, children with cochlear implants take years to develop proper speech, take years to actually discern sounds and be able to interpret it. So it's not like, and what happens, sadly, in a lot of situations, they get a cochlear implant, it costs, lakhs and lakhs of rupees, and then they think everything's fine. But it doesn't work that way. It requires ongoing speech therapy. Every month you have to, or every 2 months you have to calibrate it and reset it. You have to test it. I know many people who have implants, and some have been very successful, but it's taken years for them to develop that success. And you'll see some YouTube videos where all of a sudden, a eureka moment, my child heard, and I'm not saying that doesn't happen, but it's more the exception than the rule.
And you touched upon prevailing attitudes. I've lived in the US for a couple of years, and I was quite surprised that it's because your country loves to go to wars as well. So there are a lot of veterans with a lot of disabilities. But the positive of that is they've built their cities where the cities are accessible to everybody. You don't need somebody to take you to work. You can go to work, you can get the bus, you can get the subway. And the best way was described to me by somebody who was blind, and he said, you call us disabled because you've built a world which is not accessible to us. If I was to turn off all the lights in here, then you're the ones with the disability and I'm the one who's at an advantage. So in terms of the attitudes that we have here, how much do they contribute to that? What you mentioned, hi mazur hai. Once that bichargi comes, that this person will not ever be able to do anything, and we will always have to take care of this person or treat them a certain way, rather than building a world where they can become something themselves without always being mazur.
Yeah, so very well stated. And that is a challenge for any society, really, because caring for those with disabilities they're a key part of the society. There was a document written by the British Council some years ago, Moving from the Margins, which estimates there's upward of 13% of the Pakistani population has some form of a disability. That's a huge number. Pakistan has not really moved sufficiently to become inclusive. There's a lot of talk, at the most basic level, the most simplest assistive thing you could do is build a ramp so someone in a wheelchair could access a building.
You've seen the ramps that people build just to be compliant.
Yeah.
It was dead traps.
And they're so steep you can't. But the point is that at least they did something. A lot of people don't even do anything. It should be a law. I mean, it is a law, but it should be enforced that all public buildings, banks, and government offices should at least have a ramp. But that's only one small facet, right? When you talk about blind or deaf or other disabilities. And it requires a lot of effort. It requires support of the government. It requires support of the private sector. And speaking of Omer and now PDP, they've done great work towards creating this awareness and stimulating the conversation, if you will, President and Mrs. Alvi were very vocal about these things and did a great job in that sphere. But there's a long way to go. And it's a big need. See, you made a good statement.
Since you've mentioned Alvi, congrats on your sitara.
Oh, thank you. I wear it proudly on my lapel.
Congratulations.
And it was actually, I got this award, but it was really an award that recognized all the efforts of our whole team, which I have to give them credit. I just am a figurehead maybe, but they do a lot of the heavy lifting. There's a great definition of empowerment. Empowerment is not something you do for somebody. It's moving the obstacles out of the way so they can do what they need to do. And that's really what we're talking about when we're talking about creating opportunities for those with disabilities. Again, I've had this discussion with government officials, with business leaders. It's something that needs to continue to be talked about, and there needs to be positive actual action plans in place to make it happen.
I might as well say it in Urdu because I'm sure you've heard this. When you go to government organization and you're like, there are 1 million deaf children, they're probably like, Sir, 6 million to वैसे ही बच्चे बाहर हैं school के.
Yes.
I'm sure you've heard things like this.
You
like
get
when
that.
you make that case, they're probably like, we already have like millions of kids out of school anyway. So why should we care about these children in particular?
Well, I don't want to say the government has said that to us because they haven't. But I've heard that from people. Oh, what are you doing this? It's like, you're taking care of these kids. What about all those kids? I said, what's the difference? They're still all children. They still, if anything, they need more attention because nobody else is paying attention to them. And again, to their credit, I think the Sindh government has been very supportive in spite of whatever challenges there are. And I know they don't always get a good rep, but the Department of Empowerment for Persons with Disabilities, which used to be the Special Ed Department, very supportive. We have great, partnerships. 3 of our schools in Sindh were buildings given to us by the Sindh government. We renovated them, but we have them on a no-cost basis. We have over 300 children in each of those schools. So, credit to them for being proactive, and they're open to doing more. Similarly, in Punjab, we've had that, and now we're opening a new school in Nowshera, KP, which will be the first one in that area.
Beautiful. For people who are listening, people who have these attitudes, maybe they're not listening, but people who are listening might have family members who have these attitudes. And as somebody who interacts with parents and maybe gets them to change their minds, how do they approach that conversation that these regressive ideas need to maybe, or these attitudes that we have towards maybe need to change? What are those conversations like, and what can people who are listening maybe apply to people around them?
Well, it's interesting. It's so easy to sort of be critical or judgmental when something doesn't touch you personally. But when someone in your own circle, whether it's your family or friends, has, in this case, say a child with a disability or some illness, all of a sudden the reality strikes at home, and you're not so dismissive in that regard. On the positive side, I think the Pakistani community, for the most part, has been supportive. They are compassionate because a lot of them face these situations in their homes. I don't have any secret sauce here, but I think just having the conversation and sharing viewpoints can be helpful, and pointing out the challenge that these children face and some of the good work being done by various organizations, and bringing them over and visit. I invite anyone to come and visit DeafReach and see what's going on.
Yeah, maybe it's like highlighting some of the success stories.
Yeah.
That always helps, that if this person could do it, why?
Well, you know what? That project which we have ongoing with KFC, this has created so much awareness, because when you walk into the restaurant and you go up to the counter and start trying to order, all of a sudden you're the one who's handicapped because you don't know their language. So to help all you handicapped people, we made these big picture menus so you could point. The tables are turned, you see?
So if you look at the American president speaking, if you go to any concert, there's always a person signing.
Interpreting, yeah.
Somebody even snuck into one of Obama's speeches who was not Do you know about this?
That was not Obama. That was the Mandela.
Yeah, somebody faked their
he
credentials
faked
and just signed
Big scandal.
random things and somehow got
And
that
the
close.
deaf community was so upset, man. But now they have interpreters at rap concerts.
So I'm assuming that's by law, right?
Yeah.
Because if everybody's doing it, so somebody has made that mandatory.
There's laws and there's just also best practices. You know, Americans are very sort of politically conscientious, so they know that there's a group out there that are potential voters, let's say. You can't ignore them. But yes, there are laws that there has to be closed captioning. There has to be interpretation. Now, there's a law that was recently passed last year in Pakistan that says that all media programs have to have a sign language interpretation. So I think the law was written too broadly because nobody's going to be able to really do that. But at least if the news, for example, was signed twice a day, morning and evening, think of these 10 million deaf people around the country who would all of a sudden be brought into the mainstream, at least to learn what's going on. And I've had talks with media channels about this, and they don't seem to take it forward. So somewhere we're going to have to make a breakthrough.
I'm sure even if they want to, it's a resource. Like, for instance, I would love for all of our podcasts to have that. But like the timelines that we work with, the turnaround time.
And there's very few trained interpreters in Pakistan.
And there's an organization called Connect here who do some really good work.
Yes. But they have limited bandwidth. To their credit, they've created this amazing app. So if you're deaf and you go to the hospital and you need an interpreter, you don't have to have a physical person with you. You just call in on the app and the interpreter will be right on the screen there, talking to the doctor or the lawyer or the police or whoever you need. So that's a huge resource. But if we're talking about having physical in-person interpreters, they're not enough to go around. So this is a whole program that needs to be developed more.
Yeah, maybe at hospitals it should pretty much be mandated that they should have one person there at least should understand sign language, or maybe ask all your receptionists to know basic sign language. I mean
that's ideal.
That sounds like something that should be required. There's also a video where apparently this Pakistani girl has created this app that when you sign, the app recognizes and it turns into words. Do you know anything about that?
There's been a lot of these so-called breakthroughs. None of them are really all that viable at this point in time. I mean, with AI and new technology, this is one area that a lot of people are working on. But to date, there's really no success story in that regard.
I mean, one hopes that if something like this develops.
I think that, if we get down to the grassroots here, or the bottom line, when we talk about, and we're talking about deaf children, let's say, there's two pathways. There's a medical pathway that if there's some physical blockage, maybe it can be fixed. If the eardrum is ruptured, maybe it can be repaired. If there's, inner ear infections, any of those things, because those can create hearing loss. And if the family has sufficient resources and is a good candidate for a cochlear implant, keeping in mind that cochlear implants are most effective when done up to the age of 2 years. When you're older than that, the results are not as good. So, but these are very limited situations, right? The other pathway is rehabilitation through education. The hard, long course of taking a child from kindergarten up through his metric and inter and even college, and making that person a resourceful, independent, self-reliant human being. And that's where the real work comes in.
And does that constantly stay a parallel track, or is the idea that if we get these kids in from kindergarten to metric to inter, then you can send them to an IBA or a LUMS?
So right now, DeafReach has grown over the years. I mean, when we started, we were a primary, then we added a metric, then we did inter, and now we have a 2-year BA program. We're one of the few that has a higher education program in the country. And inshallah, next year we're going to have a 4-year degree program, a master's degree program. Now, you can't, not that you can't, but it's not so easy to send a deaf student to LUMS without an interpreter. And there's very few interpreters that can afford to be 100% committed side by side with a child in a mainstream university. So the better solution is to create a university program in our own schools so that the courses are taught in sign language. And this is our goal for establishing this 4-year master's program. We're doing this in partnership with Karachi University. And it's on track. And we're just waiting for some final, fine-tuning, and inshallah it will happen.
You mentioned about the language. There's also a lot of debate around that, and oftentimes it comes from people outside the community. Like, for instance, even when I came back and I was on my social justice, virtue signaling, high moral ground train, I was like, no, they should be called differently abled people. Then I spoke to people who are disabled, and they're like, no, we're fine with the word. It's people outside who use these words like special, differently abled.
Well, there's a proper politically correct vocabulary when talking about persons with disabilities. And as I mentioned earlier, when we're talking about deaf, they're not deaf and dumb. They're not hearing impaired. People with disabilities don't like that term differently abled. Pakistan has come up with it and used it everywhere, but it's not appropriate. They're not differently abled. They're just as able as anybody else, and any quote able person also has some kind of disability. Maybe it's psychological, maybe it's hidden, but it's still there. So when we're done, I'll send you a document of correct terminology that can be used.
But I do want to get at the fact that these words mean what they mean, and using it for that is what you should do. But using them as insults in other conversations is where the problem rises, right? If the waiter isn't listening to you and you're like, oh, are you deaf? Behere ho kya? Or like, andha ho gaya ho kya? Yeah, that's where the problem starts.
Yeah, I guess. I think the greater sensitivity is when you're addressing a person with a disability, that you're not diminishing that person, that you're showing respect, that you're not labeling him because of his disability, but he is a person with a disability. He's not a disabled person. So there's just like kind of a mindset there. Yeah. But I don't get too far off on that now. So
yeah, it all goes back to the mindset, right? So if you are somebody who uses disabilities, like for instance, people who call somebody a woman as an insult, it speaks to what your attitude towards women will be.
Of course.
So I've had a few politicians come on the podcast and they've been like, "Ye langdi luli government hai," and I'm like, no, you're just using a disability as an insult to describe a government that you're not a fan of, and that then bleeds into what you think of actual people with disabilities and probably informs your attitude towards them as well.
Very true.
So there are few questions which people had sent as well, but more than questions, people told me to pass on their appreciation for all the work that you did.
Thank you.
You seem to have a lot of well-wishers and fans.
Really?
Yes.
Wait, I'm curious. Like, why? Because you send a note out that you're doing this, and people responded?
Yes.
Wow, I must be famous.
Yes, you are. Thank you, Richard, for being the voice of deaf. We people can't thank you enough for your dedication.
Wow.
To what extent is it a state's duty to accommodate? And this person has written differently abled individuals. That part we've already answered.
That's okay. I'm not going to get nitpicky on that.
I'll get picky on your behalf.
Obviously the state should, but let's be realistic. The state has so many challenges, limited resources, limited leadership, and let's not talk about the problems, but let's talk about solutions. And I find in Pakistan, the greatest solution has been having these public-private partnerships, where the government can't do everything. They have funds, they have buildings, they might not have the expertise so much. Whereas a smaller organization like us, we have that expertise. We're willing to do our most, but we need that support. So we've partnered up and with the private sector like KFC. So, and keep in mind too, our work is 100% funded through donations. And that comes from the private sector. And I'm very proud to say 90% of our support comes right from the local Pakistani community here. We don't have any big foreign connections. We're not one of those NGOs that has Pajeros and big bank accounts, My first car here was a little FX. But my point being that the Pakistani community has been so supportive and, which we're very grateful for. In fact, the other 10% comes from the Pakistani diaspora abroad. I go to the States usually once or twice a year. We do some events and raise some funds. And all those attendees are also Pakistanis there. So,
when somebody asked you whether, I think somebody commented saying it's not for profit organization, and you provided that caveat that it's not for profit in terms of it's not a capitalistic organization hungry for profits, but it's an organization that still needs to raise money, and that's a huge part of it.
We don't have a treasure chest. I wish we did.
So for people who are looking to maybe do something for these causes and social justice causes that they care about, do you feel that a model? What's the model that works where? And you even spoke about when you were hiring somebody said that I need my needs taken care of and I still care about this project. So what do you feel is a good balance between ensuring that the people who work for you have a competitive salary so that the organization is a lot more sustainable rather than to maybe just think of it in terms of service?
That's kind of the ongoing challenge in any nonprofit, if you will. And I don't like to use the word charity as much because charity has sort of a little bit of a different connotation. But an organization like ours, who is providing this educational service, our greatest cost is the salaries of personnel. Because we need trained teachers, we need custodians, we need drivers, everything that makes a school run. That's the heart of what we do to
provide transportation to every kid.
So every single child in all of our schools gets a pick and drop to their home and back. Yeah. And I'm talking about up to 60, 70 kilometers each way. Like in Sakkar, we have our school there in Golimar, and we pick children from Khairpur, Shikarpur, Panoakil. That's
my village.
Really? Mashallah.
I'm from Shikarpur.
So we pick about 60 children every day from Shikarpur and bring them to Sakkar, Panoakil, Pirjogo, Pyarlo.
I should come.
You should definitely come.
I should visit.
And every child gets a hot lunch because they come from poor families. They can't bring food. And they travel an hour and a half sometimes each way just to come in our very fancy open-air Ravi pickups that are air-conditioned with the wind, So
I'm sure there's this. You probably have a low attendance these days. People who don't want to travel in this heat.
School starts August 15th now, so that's good actually, because like I told you, our kids in Nawab Shah call it kebab shah when they're sitting in the back of the van and it's open and you're getting air, but it's almost like you're roasting, right?
So the model.
So the point is. And we struggled a lot in our early days, again, because we're very dependent on donations. I remember the very first teacher we ever hired, because we couldn't even afford a teacher. It was my wife and myself and my son. And I'm proud to say that same teacher, who was deaf, by the way, he was a student who was very bright. And I said, now you be a teacher. We need your help. You're good. And I remember his first salary was 3,000 rupees a month. And he's still with us today, and he's one of our managers who oversees all our schools. And
hope he's gotten a raise since then.
Yeah, he did. He got Torasan. And we try at least when someone joins to start them at whatever the government minimum salary requirement is. And every year we give a 10 to 15, sometimes 20% raise because we want to take care of our people. So that's investing. That's investing in the project. That's not, it's just the cost of doing this kind of business, right? But everything else, we're very, very frugal in what we do. I mean, we want to provide the best services possible to give our kids the best experience possible. while at the same time being very cost conscious, because this is donor money. And, we're very, very conscientious and transparent. And I think people have come to trust us that we'll use their investment wisely. I know that's always a challenge in the nonprofit world. People are concerned, well, where should I give my money? Do I know it's going to the right thing? Is it being used the right way? How much is being used for overhead, et cetera, and so on. So we're very conscientious about those things, and I think that's important.
You mentioned the negative connotation of charity, but there's also a legal element to that, right? That certain organizations are eligible for charity.
Yes, and I mean, charity, especially in Pakistan, it's a good thing in the sense of, zakat is mandatory, and that's one of the largest sources of contribution to organizations. And you think of these large organizations that are really serving, especially in the health sector, right? Indus and Shaukat Khana and just the cyber knife. So just amazing innovations and amazing care for the people. I marvel because you don't find this in a lot of countries. In America, you can't afford to be sick if you don't have very high-cost health insurance, right? So I think Pakistan has done wonderful things in that regard.
Deafness on the disability spectrum has the best employability outcomes. What are the actual assistive technologies that can be mass-produced and used in low-income countries?
Great question, and it's a good point. If we talk about building a more inclusive Pakistan or any country, one of the most important things is to include people in the job market, because they have to be able to earn. Otherwise, they become dependent on the state or dependent on their families. And in the past, there hasn't been a lot of hiring of persons with disabilities. No matter, I know Pakistan has this 2% quota, et cetera. But this is something we've emphasized over the years, and we started as this project with KFC. They were kind of the front runners that opened the doors. When others saw that, oh, wow, these kids they're doing a good job. It's not just a pity project. This is they're really making it work. We reached out to others in the corporate sector, and I'm proud to say that in the past few years, we've placed over 2,500 boys and girls in jobs in the textile industry, pharma. Some of our graduate students from our BA program were hired last year by Habib Metro in Hyderabad. And there's just so much opportunity everywhere. So to address the first part of that question, we've made great strides, but there's still so much more to go. I'm not so sure about the need to have assistive devices. The deaf don't need that. It's not like they have to hear to work, unless, most of the deaf people are not working in customer direct, where they have to communicate directly with the customer, except maybe in the KFC model.
They'll probably have an interpreter.
But they don't have an interpreter, but as I said, we made picture menus. We have sign language brochure that you can learn some basic sign language. The app is right there. You can get it on your phone. They survive. In fact, the KFC branches run by the deaf have the highest income of all the branches because people go out of their way to go eat there. The chicken tastes better.
The gamified versions for training vision and executive functioning disabilities are far more effective in rewriting the brain than old school interventions. Does something like this exist for hearing loss?
Wow.
ये तो मेरे सर के ऊपर से गुजर गया सवाल. I'm sure you understood it.
Yeah. But it's a good point that these days, if children have access to technology, like as simple as a smartphone or a pad or a computer, then gamification of learning processes is really beneficial, like basic literacy, basic numeracy. And this is something we're working on. As I mentioned earlier, we're setting up these satellite schools, but they're not big brick and mortar schools with fully trained teachers. The heart of those satellite schools is that we're creating digital learning content in sign language that they simply have to, a teacher in that classroom will simply have to follow with the kids. So, and gamification is part of what we're working on as well. So thank you for that question, whoever wrote it in.
What was the most effective method he's come across for breaking down the stigma associated with disabilities? What's the secret sauce? What are the 22 herbs and spices?
I think the formula for breaking down any barrier is patience, perseverance, and a good sense of humor. Because things don't always work out the way you would like. People don't always listen or choose to understand as much as you would like. But if you keep talking about it, keep showing examples, keep creating awareness, it changes things over time.
I mean, if that's the secret sauce to life, I'm doing well. Patience, perseverance, and sense of humor.
Yeah. Those are the things that have kept me in Pakistan, quite honestly.
I don't have much, but ye teen cheezein to hai mera.
ठीक है, let's make a motto and hang it on your wall, you know.
Like you probably have you seen Bollywood films? Like Amitabh Bachchan has this Gurukul with Parishtara, some parampara.
Acha,
Maybe
okay.
we should also have persistence.
Yeah.
Humor.
Patience, persistence, and humor.
As an Indian, I want to thank him for his service to humanity. Thank you. Has the government of Pakistan ever created roadblocks and obstacles in operations, like asking for bribes and stuff? Why would he tell you? Why would he?
It's a good question, and quite honestly, we haven't faced that challenge. Although people probably would surmise that must be the case, but I mean, we've had, and our largest dealings have been with the Sindh government because our work has grown organically, starting in Karachi. Then we opened. Now we have 6 schools in Sindh, 2 in Punjab, and 1 coming up in KP. But the Sindh government has given us these buildings. They've provided support, and I think there's that interesting. You asked me, do I have a story? When we have our school here in Gulistani Johar, which traditionally in years past was always considered, a bad area, right? There was always a lot of fighting, and this school is located just up the road from Darus-Sahat Hospital. It's on the main road, but still, when we were given the building, which was sitting empty, it was a ghost school, huge complex. It's, a political party that starts with M had taken up residence in the school. We're flying their flag. We're having their meetings. And one day we show up and said, "Oh, hi, this is now our school." And these guys looked at us like, who are these Gora guys, But again, to their credit, we had a great discussion. We told them what we're going to do. This is going to be a school for deaf children. But our teachers, quite honestly, were afraid to go. They said, we can't go there. Our families won't let us.
Because you don't need to know sign language to know what this means.
Exactly.
This means mobile nigal.
So I talked to them. I said, look, we're going to do this, but our teachers need to be comfortable. And they said, sir, we are here to serve. We will protect. We will create this area as an area of peace, sukoon. And to this day, and the school opened, the teachers came, we never had one issue the whole time. And the whole neighborhood was transformed. So anyway, all that to say, we haven't had any of those negative experiences with the government. Things can move a little slow sometime, but that's just par for the course, I guess.
Last question is, how can we create systems in our country so that disabled people like the blind and such can be better accommodated so that they can live a life with dignity? And how can we create awareness amongst people about these issues and fight social stigmas against?
Well, I think that's kind of been the gist of everything we've just talked about. So I don't know if I should repeat that, but it requires an effort from the government sector, from the public sector. And I think organizations like ours and now PDP and others have to be the ones to stimulate those conversations. I think the greatest need is to get the business leaders more invested because they're the ones that can create economic opportunities. And there's a lot of scope for growth and making a difference in this area,
and when people feel hopeless in Pakistan, I think people like you should inspire them to feel hope.
Inshallah.
And I get accused a lot of only showing negative sides of Pakistan on this podcast.
No.
So I'm glad you come as a shining light.
Thank you. I told you I get to speak at a lot of international forums, And, I've spoken at the United Nations and in Paris and in London and these conferences. And I count myself as an ambassador for Pakistan because everybody has such a negative connotation of what goes on here. And I was the guest speaker at the Apna doctors event in the U.S. a few years ago in Dallas. 3,000 doctors and their wives in this huge hall. And before I came out, people were asking me, how can you live in Pakistan, And when I was up on stage, I said, let me just take a minute. I want to say something. People were asking me, how can you live in Pakistan? Everything I see on the TV is so bad. I said, you all need to get a bigger TV. There's good things happening. Yeah. Let's try to emphasize more the positive than the negative. And everybody laughed, and I think they remembered that.
Yeah, I think it's organizations like yours, now PDP, KDSP, people who are doing phenomenal work, who continue to inspire. If people want to come check out the schools, how do they visit?
If you're in Karachi, we'd love to have you come over. We're just in Gulestani Johar, just at the very beginning, right up this.
For people who are listening, if they want to come, do they sign up? Do they call?
They can just call. If you go to our website, which is DeafReach.com, you'll see a UAN number. Just call, and if you're in Karachi or any of the cities where our schools are, and we'll put you in touch with the principal. You're more than welcome to come over.
I think all the vloggers, content creators who are listening should go and highlight this. And
I would love that. I think that would create a lot more awareness. Yeah. And this is something I was going to say, like people like yourself and others have so much power in their hands, really, to create that awareness.
No, I'd thank you to Shafat for putting us in touch.
He's our ambassador now.
He's the ambassador for all these great causes.
I know, it's wonderful.
He's one of those shining lights of Pakistan as well. That man does a lot more good in a single day than I probably do in a month. And for people who want to donate, can they just go online, donate? How do?
Yeah, exactly. DeafReach.com. You can sponsor a student. You can sponsor a classroom. Anything you like.
How much is a student?
Our student costs are 15,000 rupees a month, which might sound a bit high, but you have to realize we're working with children with disabilities. There's special, facilities that are needed. Plus, included in that is the transportation costs, hot lunch, uniform, vocational training materials, a parent training program because we bring the parents in on Saturdays and teach them sign language. So there's a lot that goes into that. But, each according to his ability. It's not the amount that counts. It's the heart that counts.
Show heart, people. Thank you so much for all the heart that you've shown us. And continue inspiring, continue doing the great work.
Shukriya.
And thank you for listening. Take care. Bye-bye.